Some of the most useful foods in our gardens today are not the newest varieties at the garden center. They are the crops that slowly disappeared from everyday gardens while a smaller selection of familiar foods took their place. These forgotten foods include fruits, roots, tubers, greens, and perennial crops with remarkable growing habits. Some can return year after year. Some produce food beneath the soil. Others offer flavors that are almost impossible to find in an ordinary supermarket, and many have histories that stretch back generations. But this is not a list of names to scroll through and forget. Each plant has a reason it was grown, a reason it became overlooked, and a lesson for the modern gardener. So we're going to uncover them one at a time, starting with the crops that deserve another chance in today's garden. As we move deeper into the list, the plants become stranger, more unusual, and harder to believe they were ever pushed aside. And when we reach number 13, you'll understand why some forgotten foods are worth bringing back, not simply because they are unusual, but because they can change the way we think about what a productive garden can actually grow. Let's begin. First is pawpaw, one of the most fascinating fruits native to eastern North America. The tree, Asimina triloba, produces large soft fruits with custard-like flesh and a flavor often compared with banana, mango, or melon. Pawpaw is not a tropical tree despite its tropical-looking fruit. It is adapted to temperate climates, especially moist woodland conditions. Young trees appreciate partial shade, consistent soil moisture, and protection from harsh competition. As they mature, they can handle more sunlight if their roots have reliable moisture. The important gardening lesson is that pawpaw does not behave like an apple tree. Its pollination can be unreliable because individual flowers are not especially attractive to honeybees. Planting two genetically different trees improves fruit set, and gardeners sometimes hand-pollinate flowers with a small brush. The fruit ripens quickly, so harvest timing matters. A pawpaw that gives slightly under gentle pressure is generally ready, and ripe fruit should be eaten or processed soon because it does not have the storage life of an apple. Remove the large seeds before eating the flesh. If your climate suits pawpaw, this forgotten fruit can become one of the most productive conversations in your garden. Second comes yacon, a completely different story. Yacon, Smallanthus sancifolius, comes from the Andes and is valued for its crisp, juicy underground storage roots. It is important to distinguish yacon from the potato because the part commonly eaten develops differently. Yacon forms storage roots while also producing rhizomes from which the plant returns. The roots contain fructo-oligosaccharides, carbohydrates that are less digestible than ordinary sugars, giving yacon its characteristic sweetness. That does not mean yacon is a free pass for unlimited consumption. Some people experience digestive discomfort from large amounts. In the garden, give yacon fertile, well-drained soil, regular moisture, and a long growing season. Plant the rhizome pieces or crowns rather than trying to grow the crop from the edible storage root itself. During active growth, the plant produces a tall, leafy canopy. As the season cools, the foliage begins to decline and energy moves into underground storage. Dig carefully after the tops die back because the roots can be brittle. Letting harvested roots rest for a period can increase sweetness as stored carbohydrates change. If frost threatens before the roots mature, protect the plant or adjust planting time. Yacon demonstrates a powerful principle. A garden can produce sweet food underground without behaving like a conventional fruit crop.
Third is scarrot, an old root vegetable that deserves attention precisely because it is unfamiliar. Sisum cicerum is a perennial or long-lived member of the carrot family, producing clusters of slender, pale roots. Its underground structure makes it different from a single-root carrot. The edible roots can be harvested after sufficient growth, and their sweet flavor becomes especially interesting when cooked. Scarrot prefers fertile soil with enough moisture and a relatively loose structure. Compacted ground is a problem because root crops need physical space for expansion. Before planting, loosen the soil deeply rather than creating a narrow planting hole. Mature compost can improve structure, but avoid creating a rich, loose pocket surrounded by hard soil because roots may behave unpredictably at the boundary. Keep weeds under control while plants establish, since young scarlet competes poorly with aggressive vegetation. Harvesting is a balancing act. Dig too early and the roots are small, leave them too long and digging a dense perennial clump becomes harder. A garden fork is safer than a shovel because it reduces the chance of slicing the roots. Scarlet is a reminder that food diversity can begin below the soil's surface. Fourth is good King Henry, a perennial leafy vegetable whose botanical name is Blightum bonus henricus. Unlike crops that demand annual replanting, this plant can remain in one location for years when conditions suited. The young leaves and shoots have traditionally been cooked as greens, while young flower shoots can also be used. Its perennial habit makes it interesting for low-disturbance gardens because soil does not need to be repeatedly tilled around an annual crop. Give it fertile, well-drained soil and consistent moisture, especially during establishment. Do not assume perennial means maintenance-free. Mature clumps can become crowded, reducing vigor and increasing competition among shoots. Division during suitable dormant or cool periods can renew the planting. Harvest lightly from young plants so the root system can establish enough reserves. The important principle is to treat perennial vegetables as living infrastructure. Instead of extracting everything from the soil and restarting each season, you maintain a productive plant and harvest a portion of its growth. Over time, that can reduce soil disturbance and create a permanent food-producing zone.
Fifth is the sunchoke, also called Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus. Despite its name, it is neither from Jerusalem nor a true artichoke. It is a North American sunflower relative that produces edible underground tubers. Above ground, it can become extremely tall, sometimes making it useful as a seasonal screen or windbreak. Underground, however, is where the harvest develops. Sunchokes are vigorous because small pieces of tuber can remain in the soil and regenerate. That is both an advantage and a warning. Choose the planting location carefully. If you put them in a tiny raised bed beside delicate crops, you may regret it. Containment and deliberate harvesting are better strategies. Soil should drain reasonably well, although the plant tolerates a range of conditions. Harvest after the foliage has died back, especially after cool weather has improved tuber quality. Dig thoroughly if you intend to remove the crop, because fragments left behind can return. Sunchokes also contain significant amounts of inulin, a fermentable carbohydrate that can cause gas or digestive discomfort in some people. Introduce them gradually, rather than eating a huge serving the first time. Their value is not just novelty. They combine persistence, edible underground storage, and tall, seasonal biomass. Sixth is the American groundnut, Apius americana, a native North American vine that forms edible underground tubers. It is not the same plant as the common peanut. American groundnut is a climbing legume, and its underground storage structures occur along rhizomes. Because it is a legume, it participates in nitrogen-fixing relationships with soil bacteria, although gardeners should not assume that every legume automatically supplies large amounts of nitrogen to neighboring crops. The plant needs support if you want the vine to climb efficiently. A trellis, fence, or sturdy frame can turn its vertical growth into useful garden architecture. Moist, fertile soil is generally favorable, and the plant can spread through underground structures. That makes site selection important. Harvesting can disturb the rhizomes, so mark the planting area clearly. Tubers vary in size, and cooking is recommended rather than treating them as a raw snack. The fascinating part is the combination of edible underground storage with a climbing growth habit.
In a diversified garden, that means one plant can occupy vertical space while producing food below ground.
Seventh is American persimmon, Diospyros virginiana. If you have ever tasted an unripe persimmon, you already know why harvesting discipline matters. Unripe fruit can be intensely astringent because of soluble tannins. When the fruit reaches proper ripeness, however, the texture softens and the flavor becomes rich and sweet. The tree is adaptable across much of eastern and central North America, but individual trees may differ in sex and fruiting behavior, so selecting suitable cultivars or planting more than one tree can improve reliability. Persimmon trees develop substantial root systems, so they need adequate space and should not be planted where future roots will conflict with foundations or utilities. They can tolerate less than perfect soil once established, but good drainage remains valuable. The key troubleshooting mistake is picking fruit too early because it looks colored. Color alone is not the final test. Depending on cultivar and conditions, fruit may need to soften substantially before eating. Fallen ripe fruit can attract wildlife, so harvest promptly if you want to keep it. This forgotten food teaches patience rather than forcing a crop to fit a supermarket timetable. Eighth is serviceberry, a name covering several Amelanchier species and commonly known as Juneberry or Saskatoon in different regions. These shrubs or small trees produce small fruits that resemble blueberries, but their growth and seasonal timing are different. Serviceberries are valuable because they can occupy the shrub layer rather than competing with annual vegetables in open beds. They generally prefer well-drained soil and good light for dependable fruiting, although some species tolerate partial shade. Pruning should be purposeful rather than aggressive. Remove damaged, crossing, or very old stems when appropriate while preserving a balanced structure. Birds can discover the berries extremely quickly, so wildlife pressure is often a bigger harvesting problem than disease. Netting, timing, or shared harvest can help. If a serviceberry produces flowers but few fruits, investigate pollination conditions, weather during bloom, and whether the plant is suited to your climate before reaching for fertilizer. Excess nitrogen may produce foliage at the expense of reproductive growth. Serviceberry is a perfect example of a food crop that can become part of a layered garden rather than another annual bed. Ninth is medlar, Maspilus germanica, an ancient fruit that looks almost unfinished when first harvested. The fruit traditionally requires bledding, a controlled softening process that transforms its firm, astringent state into a soft, sweet, jam-like texture. That unusual requirement is one reason medlar feels almost like a relic from another agricultural era. The tree itself is relatively manageable compared with many large orchard trees, although growth depends on climate, rootstock, soil, and cultivar. Give it a sunny position and well-drained soil, and avoid waterlogged ground. Pruning should maintain an open structure without removing excessive fruiting wood. The biggest lesson is that harvest quality cannot always be judged by supermarket standards. A fruit can be unattractive, soft, or oddly shaped and still be excellent food. Bledding should be done under clean, controlled conditions, watching carefully for unwanted mold or decay. If the fruit develops foul odors or extensive mold rather than the expected softening, discard it. Medlar rewards gardeners willing to learn a process rather than expecting every crop to be ready straight from the branch. 10th is sea kale, Crambi maritima, a perennial vegetable adapted naturally to coastal environments. Its thick shoots, leaves, and flower buds have been used as food, and its perennial habit makes it interesting for low-disturbance gardens. Sea kale prefers excellent drainage and sunlight. It is not a plant to bury in heavy, constantly saturated soil. In a home garden, the challenge is balancing moisture with drainage. Raised beds, sandy loam, or a well-structured soil profile can help. Simply adding sand to heavy clay is not always the answer and can sometimes create an even harder mixture. Young plants should be allowed to establish before heavy harvesting. Some traditional cultivation methods involve forcing or blanching young shoots to produce a more tender texture. That requires careful timing and airflow because excessive moisture around covered shoots can encourage rot. Sea kale demonstrates that perennial vegetables can be managed almost like orchard crops. Establish them, protect the root crown, harvest selectively, and maintain the site instead of disturbing it every few weeks. 11th is crowsney, Stachys affinis, a small tuber-forming plant that produces novelty underground structures. Its appearance alone makes it memorable. The tubers are crisp and can be cooked in several ways, but the plant's real gardening advantage is that it occupies a niche few conventional crops use. Crowsney prefers loose, fertile soil and consistent moisture during growth. The tubers are small, so harvesting can be labor-intensive. This is one reason commercial agriculture rarely treats every interesting crop as a winner. A food can be delicious and biologically productive, yet still lose economically because harvesting requires too much hand labor. For a home gardener, however, that equation changes. You are not necessarily trying to maximize tons per acre. You may value novelty, resilience, diversity, and the pleasure of harvesting something supermarkets rarely carry. Plant it where soil can be worked easily, keep competing weeds low, and harvest after the foliage declines. Any leftover tubers can regenerate, so thorough digging matters if you want to control spread. That persistence is useful, but only when you deliberately manage it. 12th is oca, Oxalis tuberosa, an Andean tuber crop with colorful underground harvests. The plant develops creeping stems and tubers as the season progresses, and it generally benefits from a long growing period. In many temperate gardens, oca behaves like a late-season crop, with tuber formation increasing as temperatures and day length change. That creates a practical problem. The plant may look healthy while the harvest remains disappointing because the growing season is too short or frost arrives before sufficient tuber development. Start early enough for the climate, protect from early cold if necessary, and avoid unnecessary disturbance of the developing roots and stems. Once frost threatens, harvest carefully. Oca also has an unusual preparation history, with exposure to light after harvest sometimes used to reduce oxalic acidity and develop sweeter flavors. Because preparation practices vary and sensitivity differs, gardeners should use established culinary guidance rather than improvising with large quantities. The larger lesson is that crop selection should match your season. A plant can be genetically capable of producing abundant food but still fail in a garden where temperature and day length do not cooperate. 13th is mashua, Tropalium tuberosum, and this is where the list becomes especially intriguing. Mashua is another Andean tuber related to nasturtiums rather than potatoes. It produces edible underground tubers and vigorous above-ground growth. Like oca, it is adapted to highland conditions and may need a long enough season for tuber production. The plant can climb or spread, so giving it room and support can improve garden management. Mashua is also notable for its strong flavor, which means it is not necessarily a direct replacement for potatoes. That is precisely why it belongs in a forgotten food series. Food diversity does not mean every crop must taste familiar. It means expanding the range of textures, flavors, harvest windows, and ecological functions available from the garden. For successful cultivation, use fertile but well-drained soil, maintain even moisture, and avoid waterlogging. Harvest after the foliage begins to decline, lifting the tubers gently. As with other unfamiliar crops, introduce the food gradually and use reliable culinary preparation information. A productive garden should not merely produce calories, it should produce options. 14th is ulluco, Ullucus tuberosus, another Andean crop whose underground tubers can come in striking colors. The plant has fleshy leaves and creeping growth, and it is adapted to cool highland environments. In warmer or seasonally challenging gardens, timing becomes critical. Excessive heat can interfere with tuber development, while frost can end the crop prematurely. The best strategy is to think about ulluco as a climate-matching experiment, rather than assuming that a famous heritage crop will perform everywhere. Start with healthy planting material, use loose soil, and keep moisture consistent without creating stagnant wet conditions. Because tubers develop underground, avoid repeated digging during the season. If the crop produces abundant foliage but few tubers, examine day length, temperature, planting date, and season length before blaming fertility. More fertilizer cannot manufacture a missing environmental signal. This is an important principle in high-yield gardening. Yield is the result of interacting variables, not one bottle, amendment, or trick. Sometimes the smartest intervention is choosing a better planting date or a better adapted crop.
15th is the walking onion, also called Egyptian onion or tree onion, traditionally associated with Allium proliferum types. Instead of relying entirely on seed, it can produce small bulbils above the flower stalk, which can bend toward the ground and establish new plants. That unusual reproductive strategy gives the plant its walking reputation. For gardeners interested in reducing annual replanting, this is extremely useful. Plant it in fertile, well-drained soil with adequate sunlight. Allow some mature stalks to produce bulbils if you want the patch to renew itself. If you want orderly rows, harvest the bulbils and replant them deliberately rather than letting every plant establish wherever it falls. Good airflow helps reduce foliar disease, and consistent moisture supports growth without creating waterlogged roots. The key advantage is not that the plant grows with zero work, it is that the plant can help reproduce its own planting material. That shifts the garden from a system where you constantly purchase inputs toward one where part of the next season's planting stock is produced inside the garden itself. 16th is cardoon, Cynara cardunculus, a close relative of the globe artichoke. Cardoon is grown primarily for its thick leaf stalks rather than the unopened flower head. It is large, architectural, and capable of becoming a dramatic garden plant. It also requires more space than a typical lettuce or carrot, which makes site planning essential. Give it full sun, fertile soil, and reliable moisture while it establishes. In climates where it behaves as a perennial, protect the crown from severe cold and excessive winter wet. Some traditional culinary methods involve blanching the stalks to reduce bitterness and improve tenderness. Blanching works by limiting light exposure, which changes the tissues and reduces the intensity of green compounds and flavors. It must be done carefully so the plant remains ventilated and dry enough to avoid rot. Cardoon demonstrates another reason forgotten crops disappeared from mainstream farming. They can demand space, labor, processing, or specialized preparation that standardized agriculture does not favor. In a home garden, those disadvantages can become opportunities because you can grow small quantities for quality rather than mass market efficiency.
Now, step back and look at what these 16 plants have in common. They are not a random collection of strange vegetables. They represent different layers of a food-producing ecosystem. Pawpaw, persimmon, and serviceberry occupy the woody layer. Good King Henry, sea kale, and cardoon provide perennial or semi-perennial leafy harvests. Yacon, sunchoke, skirret, groundnut, crowsn, oca, mashua, and uluco concentrate food underground. Walking onion produces planting material as part of its own reproductive cycle. Medlar turns a storage and ripening technique into part of the food system. These differences matter because a resilient garden is rarely built from one crop type. If every bed contains shallow-rooted annual vegetables, every harvest depends on constant soil preparation, irrigation, seed purchases, and timing. Adding perennials and underground storage crops creates redundancy. But do not make the mistake of planting all 16 tomorrow. Start with your climate, your soil, your available space, and your intended use. Check hardiness and local growing recommendations before ordering unusual plants. Some species spread aggressively in suitable conditions. Some need long seasons. Some require specific pollination partners. Some have specialized preparation requirements. Some are perennial and become difficult to remove once established. A forgotten crop is not automatically a good crop for every garden. The best plant is the one whose biology fits your environment. Before planting, map the garden in layers. Put tall, woody crops where they will not shade sun-loving annuals at the wrong time. Use perennial vegetables in permanent beds where their roots will not be repeatedly disturbed. Reserve contained areas for vigorous tuber producers such as sunchokes. Give climbing groundnuts a trellis rather than allowing vines to smother neighboring crops.
Keep records of planting dates, first flowering, harvest dates, pest pressure, and actual yield. This turns a novelty experiment into a measurable system.
Soil preparation should follow the crop rather than the other way around. Root and tuber crops need physical structure that allows underground organs to expand. Heavy compaction can reduce size and deform roots even when nutrients are abundant. A soil test is more useful than guessing from leaf color. If pH or nutrient levels are unsuitable, correct them based on measured conditions. Avoid excessive nitrogen simply because a plant looks slow. Too much nitrogen can drive vegetative growth while delaying reproductive or storage organ development. Compost improves organic matter and structure, but compost is not a universal substitute for mineral balance, drainage, or correct irrigation. Water management is equally important. Deep-rooted perennials generally benefit from thorough irrigation during establishment, followed by appropriate watering based on soil moisture and climate. Shallow, frequent watering can encourage a surface-dependent root system and increase disease pressure in some situations. Use mulch where appropriate to reduce evaporation and temperature swings, but keep mulch away from crowns and trunks to prevent prolonged wetness. When a plant suddenly wilts, check the soil before watering automatically. Wilting can result from drought, root damage, waterlogging, heat stress, vascular problems, or pest pressure. More water fixes only one of those causes. Pest management should begin with observation. Examine the underside of leaves, new growth, stems, flowers, and soil around the root zone. Look for patterns rather than isolated damage. A few holes may be tolerable. Rapid defoliation is a different situation. Before applying an insecticide, identify the pest and determine whether natural enemies are already controlling it. Diverse plantings can support beneficial insects, while flowering perennials can provide habitat. Mechanical barriers, hand removal, sanitation, and timing can often solve small outbreaks without turning the whole garden into a chemically managed zone. Harvesting is where forgotten crops become genuinely useful. Do not judge every food by the rules of supermarket vegetables. Pawpaw needs ripeness, persimmon needs proper maturity, medlar needs softening. Sunchokes and several tuber crops may improve in quality after cool weather. Leafy perennials often taste best when young. Cardoon requires preparation. Yacon may become sweeter after storage. Learning the correct harvest stage can transform a disappointing crop into an excellent one. Conversely, eating an unfamiliar plant raw without understanding its preparation can create unnecessary risk. Use reputable botanical and culinary references, especially for plants you have never eaten before.
There is also a deeper reason to bring forgotten foods back. Every time a garden grows only a tiny group of globally standardized crops, part of our food system becomes dependent on a narrow biological base. Genetic diversity matters because pests, diseases, drought, heat, and changing seasons do not care what is fashionable in the supermarket. A diverse garden spreads risk. One crop can fail while another succeeds. One plant can provide fruit in spring, another tubers in autumn, another greens during cool weather, and another planting material for the next season. That does not mean these crops will replace potatoes, tomatoes, beans, or carrots. They do not need to. The goal is not to reject modern agriculture. The goal is to widen the toolbox. A garden can contain familiar crops and forgotten ones side by side. You can grow tomatoes for dependable summer harvests while a pawpaw tree develops for future seasons. You can harvest carrots while experimenting with skirret. You can maintain onions while allowing walking onions to reproduce. You can grow potatoes while testing one Andean tuber in a protected bed. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson hidden inside these 16 foods. The future of gardening may not always come from discovering something nobody has ever grown. Sometimes it comes from looking backward, finding plants that survived generations of cultivation and asking why they disappeared. The answers can teach us about labor, transportation, taste, economics, climate, storage, and the demands of industrial agriculture. They can also reveal possibilities for smaller gardens that do not have to compete with the supermarket on price. So if you're standing in your garden this season, do not ask only, what grows here? Ask a better question. What could grow here that I have never considered? Maybe the answer is a native fruit tree like pawpaw. Maybe it's a persistent tuber like sunchoke. Maybe it's a perennial green, a self-propagating onion, or an unfamiliar Andean crop. Start with one. Learn its biology, give it the right conditions, record what happens, save planting material when appropriate, then expand.
Because forgotten food does not have to remain forgotten. A seed, crown, cutting, rhizome, or tuber placed into the right soil can turn a historical curiosity into tomorrow's harvest. And when you grow something unusual, you are doing more than adding another plant to the garden. You are preserving options. You are testing diversity. You are learning how food behaves outside the supermarket shelf. Most importantly, you are rebuilding a relationship with the garden in which food is not limited to whatever happens to be popular today. And maybe that is where the real journey begins. These forgotten foods remind us that a productive garden does not have to look like everyone else's. There are fruits, roots, tubers, greens, and perennial crops waiting to be rediscovered, each with its own story and its own place in a resilient food system. So choose one unusual plant, give it a place in your garden. Learn how it grows and see what it can teach you. And if you want to keep uncovering the foods that history nearly left behind, subscribe to Savage Harvest and Heal. Because here, we don't just grow food, we rediscover it, preserve it, and bring it back to life. And this is only part one. There are many more forgotten foods still waiting in the garden.